Good day. My name is Brian Proffitt. I am the Principal Community Analyst for Red Hat. I am based in South Bend, Indiana, and my function is primarily the social media and content management person for the Open Source and Standards Group at Red Hat. The Open Source and Standards Group is a team which is primarily responsible for many of the open source projects with which Red Hat works. I've been asked today to give you a presentation that we presented internally at Red Hat, but we can share with you and the broader open source community about ways in which you as a community manager or community liaison or community governance board, effective ways and tools that you can use to actually converse with your community. And that presentation is called Talk Community with Me. And with that, I'm going to share my screen very quickly here, and we'll begin the presentation. So when we talk about reaching out to community and how we make that happen, one of the things that we need to make sure that we understand, and this seems fairly obvious, is when you are conversing with a community, there's very much a centralized broadcast element that you have within a community that you need to get your point across, whatever that point may be. Hey, we have a new event, or hey, the new software is going to be released in 2 weeks and we need help. Again, that follows very much a broadcast model. But in the open source community, it's not just about a top-down or inside-out broadcast model. It's also about interaction. And this is very, very important for any kind of successful free software or open source community. Interaction is key because even if you have what is known as a benevolent dictatorship, which is how it is typically how the Linux kernel project, which is highly successful, but that is sort of the somewhat sideways jargon that we use to describe how that project is managed and governed. Even if you have that, there's still going to be a lot of interaction from the community up to the benevolent dictator, Linus Torvalds. So you cannot at any time ignore what your community is doing and what they are saying, because if you do, you will have an unhealthy community. So with that in mind, I'm going to look at some specific types of tools that people generally use within free software and open source software communities to, get that kind of interaction going. And the first one that we want to talk about today is mailing lists. Now, mailing lists is a rather old-fashioned technology. It's been around basically since emails have been around, where different, specified subscribers to these mailing lists receive messages from each other when they are mailed to the list itself. Usually most recipients will filter those messages to go to someplace else other than their inbox, and they can read conversations as email threads as they, sort through the lists and get their mail answered. Such platforms fall into the classification of being very broadcast oriented, and they're also interactive. So they pretty much fill both sides of the equation as far as centralized broadcasting and also interactivity, because it is basically email. You're going to get your email, you'll be able to send out announcements, but people can also respond to those announcements or any other topic that you're going over and apply their opinions and concerns to anything that they want on the mailing list. Email mailing lists can also fall under the category of being asynchronous in terms of you send out an email and it doesn't matter if there are people in your community who might be on the other side of the world and asleep, they're going to get that email eventually. And so it's good for that kind of communication. It's also good for synchronous communication, because if people are, up and moving and actively looking at the mailing list, you can get real-time conversations with fairly small lag times as those conversations are happening. Really, you're only limited by the speed in which your mail servers are working and also how often people actually check their inbox. As time goes on now, we are seeing situations where email is not quite the central tool that it once was. People aren't checking in as often. Best work practices do indicate that you probably shouldn't check it more than every half hour or hour. Otherwise, you might become less productive doing other things. So you have to kind of watch this because as email is sort of phasing out of the daily work environment, you may not get that synchronicity of conversation that you once might have had as 2 or 3 or 5 years ago. The overhead for mailing lists, when you go through it and actually administer something, is fairly average. Hosting a mailing list, there are third-party services that will do this for you with ease, such as like Google Groups, which is basically a fancy mailing list, or even self-hosting a mailing list using something like Mailman is not typically that difficult to do. The pros for using a mailing list, it is very archival. All conversations can be stored and searched later. Maintaining the metrics for a mailing list, how many subscribers do you have, how active is the list, is a fairly easy process to do. And because most people still have email, even though they might not be using it as much now, it is generally a universal platform in which people can, get their email, join these mailing lists. And so it's fairly ubiquitous. There are some cons to it. As I mentioned, email can be kind of slow if people aren't responding or aren't checking their email as often. Also, depending on the tool that you're going to use, email archives can be hard to search. There are some tools out there that make this easier, but typically, it's not the easiest thing to find a given conversation on an email archive list. And also, you can be suspect to spam as you go through on your mailing list, both from internal members who should know better, and then the occasional person who breaks into your email list and starts sending out spam at random intervals until you can take care of that administratively. So something to watch out for as you move through and do mailing lists. The next topic or the next platform that we use in open source communities to talk with our community is Internet Relay Chat, or IRC. IRC is a very old internet technology, and it is not very common, although people have used it in different forms, such as like AOL's Talk feature, Google's Message feature also handles IRC-like functionality. And so basically IRC, and what you're seeing now is a current model of a pure IRC client. But when we say IRC, we can also basically throw any kind of chat tool in here. Slack is a much more modern and updated IRC-like platform, would certainly fall into this category as well. But IRC or chat channels, however you want to call them, basically they definitely fall into the interactive mode of communication. Broadcasting on an IRC channel is difficult at best because even if you say, hey, this event is happening here, here, and here, after that, that chat rolls off the screen, you're pretty much going to lose that information. So broadcasting is very difficult on IRC and chat channels. Interactivity is very much the key. You can have asynchronous communication because you can, if you really want to, go back and look at what happened on the channel overnight while you were sleeping. But primarily, IRC and chat channels are very much a synchronous form of communication. They are very much real time, and that's pretty much how you're going to have to treat them. Don't count on people going back and looking because unless they leave their chat client on all the time, they may not even have access to prior conversations that have happened in the channel. The overhead administrative costs and time involved for managing IRC is pretty much low to average. It kind of depends on what you're doing. If you're doing something fairly straightforward like Slack, Slack is very easy to maintain. It's a third-party platform. They pretty much do all the hard work for you. If you're doing your own internal IRC channel on one of the many free tools out there like Freenode or OFTC. Those are public IRC servers where you can add your own channels. Again, not that difficult, although you do have to kind of keep an eye on them on a daily basis to make sure they're not being spammed. The pros for an IRC channel, fairly obvious. They're fast because everything's happening in real time. They're very conversational. These are great places for people to get into really positive conversations about what you're doing on your software project. And let's face it, it's also a good place to just sort of kick back, let your hair down, metaphorically speaking, and sort of chat about what's going on in your project and in personal lives as well. Cons, IRC and chat channels are not very universal. So, if you don't have access to IRC or if your community is not exactly technically savvy enough to understand what's going on in IRC, you're going to have a learning curve on learning how to use them. As mentioned, asynchronous communication can be extremely difficult, if not impossible. Also, they're very hard to search. You don't really get a good archiving with IRC or chat channels. And it very much depends on the user presence. If someone is not in an IRC channel, then you're not going to be able to talk to them. And that seems very obvious. But if that person is the key to answering a particular question, your community is going to have to wait for that person to come online and hope that they see the question that was addressed to them earlier. If not, you'll have to re-ask the question. So there are some cons with working with chat. I will say that many of us in Red Hat do depend on IRC, and we do have it open pretty much 24/7. So that is one way to make it work. But what works for your organization may be different. Another platform that we use to communicate with our communities is definitely forums. Forums are online bulletin boards. They actually fall back to the old bulletin board technology that was pretty much a staple on the internet just before it became commercialized in the early 90s. Those of you who might remember networks like Prodigy and CompuServe, forums are pretty much the ancestor of that and how people use to communicate. They're very much, they can be very broadcast and interactively oriented because you can put up what are known, and you can see one at the top of the screenshot, somewhat like a sticky thread, which is basically a thread that stays on top indefinitely for as long as the forum administrator wants. So you can use that to broadcast information when necessary. And of course, forums are clearly very interactive in their orientation. Forums are primarily used as an asynchronous form of communication. They are slower typically than mailing lists because people have them open. They don't or may not have them open. They're also not updated quite as often as email servers. So they kind of trend towards the asynchronous form of communication, although you can have basically synchronized real-time conversations on a forum if people are there and they're actively refreshing their screens, as they're using them. So you can get synchronicity in real time, but usually it's asynchronous. I ask a question, I come back later and see if somebody's answered it, that kind of thing. The overhead for administrating a forum falls into the average to high category. That's because of their ubiquity, forums are much more likely to be spammed, and also they're also much more likely, because they've been around for a while, they're more likely to be trolled by individuals who feel like they need to express their opinions, positive or negative, usually negative, and really don't care about helping out the community at large. That kind of problem does tend to put more of a administrative burden on your community. So if you use forums, you need to know that going in. The pros for using forums, they are very archival. All the messages that you've had from day one should be there, and they can be easily searched. They are also great places to set up what are known as FAQs, or frequently asked questions, also known as knowledge bases. So if you have a lot of questions that are asked repeatedly, you can gather them up, put them in a sticky thread and say, come look at this first. Maybe your question's been answered already. If it has, you've saved yourself, you've saved your community member the hassle of having to post their question again. So they're great for that. They can be slow, as mentioned, and because there are many different forum platforms out there, you can have a steep learning curve. Invariably, what happens is people understand forums, but they may only understand the forum that they're used to, maybe one they used 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. And if you've got something different and has a wildly different interface, you could have a steep learning curve. That's not, unfortunately, something you can really predict or plan for, but you should be aware that, not every forum looks or feels the same, and you may have to spend some time and effort getting everybody up to speed on your forum's particular idiosyncrasies. And again, as I mentioned, the overhead for administration can be very high. Forums, because things stay on screen longer, they do tend to breed a little bit more negativity in conversations. People tend to get very territorial in forums, and so they're not as willing to let things go. And you, as a forum moderator or administrator, need to be aware that you may have to spend some extra time making sure the conversations are positive and civil. And that's something to consider if you think about forums as a platform. Another kind of platform that we see in open source communities, and these are growing up much more lately, are platforms that involve question and answers. These are usually typically third-party platforms. They look like forums, but what they really are is you ask a question and then hopefully you get an answer back. And if you get that answer back to your satisfaction, then that question is marked as a positive question, usually through some sort of karma-based system, and say, this is a really good answer to a question. People should pay attention to this. So they are a form of modified forum. Stack Exchange is a third-party ask question and answer platform that is very good at this kind of communication. These kinds of platforms are extremely interactive. There is no broadcast capability for any of these. It's basically a user asks a question, and ideally another user or 2 or 3 will answer the question directly. They are very much asynchronous. There is not going to be any kind of synchronous conversation in there. And I've seen people attempt it. Rarely does it happen well. And it's something that you pretty much should not even think about doing. It's very much an asynchronous platform as far as real-time communication is concerned. The overhead is average to high, and it can be high because, again, like most forum-like platforms, you can have people who will have differing opinions, and they can use their answers to counteract each one of them. And this is especially kind of critical to avoid because that's not helping the user who asked the original question. So you have to make sure that you monitor them and make sure that answers to questions are pertinent and constructive. You also have the additional thing where you need to make sure that the question itself is pertinent. If I'm running a forum about software X, I really don't want to have somebody coming in and asking me a question about software Y, which might be a direct competitor. Typically, that's just basically a backhanded way of, pushing product Y up at the cost of product X's forum. So it's basically another kind of troll. So you're going to have to monitor these and make sure the right questions are being answered. And then finally, you need to monitor question and answer forums because you need to make sure if questions are being answered at all. No, there's nothing worse than a question out there from a new user that never gets an answer. You basically may have lost that user to your project. So you need to make sure you have an active and engaged community here that will be answering questions on these platforms. The pros, again, like forums, because they're basically a special type of forum, they're very archival, they're very searchable, and you can set up frequently asked questions and knowledge bases with ease on these kinds of platforms. Cons, for whatever reason, unless you make your FAQ very, very visible, you still have people who they say, oh, this is the question and answer. I'm going to ask my question no matter what. There seems to be some kind of disconnect between people checking to see if their question's been answered on a Q&A platform as opposed to a forum platform. It's an odd quirk, but it's something that happens. And again, like forums, there are different kinds of Q&A platforms, so you're going to have a learning curve. And for all the reasons I mentioned earlier, the administrative overhead is probably going to be higher than other kinds of communication platforms. Blogs. Blogs are pretty much well-known, like mailing lists and email platforms. Blogs are fairly well understood, so this is not going to be anything new. Broadcasts oriented, very much so. They can be interactive, especially if you do have comments on your blog. They are pretty much all asynchronous. You're going to have a one-way form of communication. If you do have any interactivity in a comment section, it's probably going to be very slow and asynchronous. The overhead for blogs can be on average, basically average to high. They can be higher than normal because you do have to kind of make sure you have content flowing on your blog and keep it active. Blogs are very good for announcing things. They are also very good about clarifying the mission and direction of your project and the software that you're making. It also is good about establishing the flavor of your project. If you have, for whatever reason, adopted an irreverent, humorous tone in your project, and that's what you kind of want your community to be about, a blog is a great way to, get that tone out there and talk about the flavor of your community. So it can be a good mirror for the positive aspects of your community. They can be slow in terms of it's not easy finding people to write for a blog. People seem to have a mental block and they say, oh, I'm not a good writer. I don't want to be on the blog. I kind of patently believe that's not true. I think that if people are passionate about a given topic, they can write about it. And you can also have people help them as well. Content needs to be engaging. You don't want to put out content up there that says, oh, today we tested, feature 1, 2, and 3, and it was great, and we were happy, and we all went and had beer. That's not exactly engaging. So you want to make sure that your content is at least going to be interesting to the community at large. And again, interaction can be low. You will have interaction on comments, but usually it's not going to be a lot in terms of volume or in terms of depth. So it's very much a broadcast-oriented platform for communication. Social media. Social media includes a number of platforms, so we're going to have to grab them all en masse and talk about them. But be aware that different social media platforms have their own individual pros and cons as you move forward. What you're going to put on Twitter is not necessarily the same kind of content you're going to put on Google Plus or Pinterest or Tumblr or Facebook. These are things that are going to be different across different channels. But in general, a social media platform is very much about broadcast. It can be interactive, and it really depends on the type of platform. For instance, it's way easier to be interactive on Facebook or Google Plus than it is to be interactive on Twitter. But you can do that. But you just have to know the strengths and weaknesses of each channel that you're working with. Because of those strengths and weaknesses, your communications can be across the board. They can be real time and synchronized. They can be non-real time and asynchronized. It depends on the channel that you're using. So it's a broad spectrum. Social media overhead is almost always high. And this usually is a surprise for people because, hey, Twitter's doing all the work. They're keeping all the bad people away. So it's Facebook. So it's Google. This much is true. Administratively, you really don't have a lot to do on a social media platform because it's pretty much handled for you. However, on the moderation side and the content production side, you really need to be active with social media because when people use social media, they're not going to wait around for a tweet every 2 or 3 days. You need to be much more active and engaging on social media platforms because typically they're going to be used by mobile devices, and people with mobile devices, you got to catch them where they are and get that content out to them as often as possible. Social media platforms are good for announcements. The engagement level is usually the highest of all of these platforms that I've mentioned because they're far more visible, they're far more publicly oriented, and you can get a lot of interaction. They're also more agile in terms of different platforms can do different things, and you can really kind of custom tailor your message depending on the channel that you're using. Again, the content needs to be engaging. Interaction with the community through social media platforms can be very time consuming, but you'll need to do that and be committed. Because, as I mentioned, your moderation administration is pretty high, if not near constant. I, as a social media person for Red Hat, I need to check with, into my channels several times a day to make sure everything's going smoothly and make sure people who are asking questions are getting answered, and making sure that the content is still being produced and there's nothing inappropriate out there. So this is something to keep in mind when you're using social media. It's not enough to set up a Twitter channel and post something out a couple of times a week. You really got to get engaged and work with this to make it work. Conferences. Conferences are another way that you can get, your message out to the broader community and also the people who are outside of your community because they're usually much more publicly oriented. Conferences can have broadcast capabilities. You can make a special announcement, hey, here comes, release 4. whatever. But they're typically also going to be much more interactive. You're going to be able to interact with people during presentations, out in the hallways in between presentations, and if you have a booth or a table at something like that, where you can talk to your users face to face and get that kind of really great interactivity with them. Because of this, they're very synchronous. If you are at a conference, you are pretty much going to be doing everything in real time. Overhead for a conference, well, that's, in some respects, it's fairly low. You show up, you do your presentation, you talk to people at the booth. That seems fairly, pretty, low key and standard. But the problem is it's also very expensive and it's also very time consuming. If you travel to a conference, that's a lot of overhead that you're going to have to push into. So you got to make sure when you do a conference, you do it well and do it right. And that will be the topic of a whole different line of presentations from OSAS and Red Hat later. As I said, the pros for a conference, they're great for announcements. They're so great for FaceTime. You can't beat that kind of personal interactivity. When people get to meet the person behind the email or the forum posts and get that kind of interactivity, it typically leads to a very positive experience. You can also give out swag, little tchotchkes or T-shirts, things that will help your community be branded and advocated even when you're not there. If somebody's wearing your T-shirt, that's advocacy for you. So it's a great way of distributing that kind of merchandise. Cons, as I said, conferences are very expensive, and they have a low cadence. Usually you're only going to be going to one or two, maybe three conferences a year, and you're going to have to figure out staffing a conference. Having people man your booth is complicated, and you have to have dedicated volunteers to do that, and make sure that they're knowledgeable in what they're talking about and can be good representatives for you. If you can pull all that together, a conference is a great way to reach out to your community. Another way of doing a real-time interactive face-to-face meet with your community is something that's a little less strenuous than a conference, and that will be the meetups. Meetups are sort of like mini conferences that you do at local or regional levels that allow you the same kind of FaceTime and real-time interaction with your community, but they're not as expensive and therefore not as painful to do. As I said, any kind of meetup that you have is going to be very interactive. They're going to be very real-time and synchronous, and their overhead is not as high. It can actually be a little bit lower, especially if you do these repeatedly. I often tell people, put together a list of how you've done a meetup, tune it, get your best practices set up, and then get that out there to the rest of your community so other people can do meetups in their city or town, and make that a standard best practice. It's usually not as hard as you think. The pros, meetups are good because they're small, they're great for training, they're great for FaceTime, they're also great for people to get shared experiences. And I didn't put it on this slide, but they can be good for getting swag out to community members as well. The cons, they need to be planned. You need to make sure that you understand cultural differences. What works on a regional level in one nation may not really work in another nation. And then finally, you're going to have to find good people, volunteers to staff these and make sure that they're going to be positive representatives of your community. And so staffing them can be difficult, and finding volunteers to even do that can be difficult. I have seen, though, that usually when people have done a meetup, they usually come away with, that really wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be. So it can be a positive experience. You just have to kind of get people over that mental hurdle and help them understand that meetups are a fairly good way of getting that kind of real FaceTime and interactivity. No matter what you do, no matter how you go through this, it is important to remember that you get the right platform for the right kind of audience. You want to make sure that if you are setting up a platform where you're helping users understand how you're using their software, how they are using your software, rather, you're not going to use something like Twitter for that. That's not the best use of Twitter. You want to use a blogging platform or a question and answer platform or a forum platform to get that done. Conversely, you're not going to spend a lot of time at an event like a conference doing things like, having big social chat sessions. Yes, those are good part of a conference, but they cannot be the be all end all of your conference. You need to have focused and organized content at a conference to make sure everybody's getting their money's worth and their time's worth out of that event. So keep this in mind as you go through and work with your communications platforms, whether it's social media, blogging, events, mailing lists, whatever you're going to be doing. Keep calm and don't cross the screens. So with that, I thank you all very much for your attendance and watching this video today. If you have any questions, please email me at bkp@redhat.com, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Until next time, thank you very much and have a great day.